My daughter abandoned me for her stepmom and cut me out of her life. Now, years later, she's reaching out because I'm doing better than her mom and is asking me to pay for her expensive wedding. To start with, I am honestly grateful that my daughter, Tara, has a great relationship with her stepmother, Dani. To give some context, my husband Mark and I did not have a good relationship. We fell in love quite young and got married because we thought that was the right thing to do. I got pregnant with Tara, and although Mark tried to be a good father, he was also extremely lazy. He never helped me with Tara in any way. I was the one who fed her, changed her diapers, stayed awake the whole night until she could sleep, bathed her, and took her for walks. Mark was the fun parent who would just come back home and spend an hour with the baby. Within that 1 hour, I would be cooking his meals or cleaning up the kitchen. Mark would then have his dinner and go into his den to play video games. If I ever asked him to help me around the house or with Tara, he would tell me how this was a woman's job and that is how God intended. This would lead to us having disagreements where I would plead with him to help me out because I was too exhausted, but he would refuse point blank. One time, I was too sick to even move around, so I asked him to please look after Tara so I could take some rest and recover. He started an argument with me, calling me lazy and saying how his mother never asked his father for help. It really angered me because he was as much Tara's parent as I was, yet he never lifted a finger. I yelled at him that if he didn't help out, I would pack my bags and leave him. This rattled him a bit, so he grumbled, but in the end, he took a leave of absence to take care of Tara so I could sleep for a few hours. As my maternity leave was coming to an end, I asked my mother if she could babysit Tara during my working hours, and she graciously accepted. Mark's mother never even offered to help, but I was fine with it. Mark didn't like that I was going back to work since he had been trying to get me to be a stay-at-home wife for a long time, but I would always refuse. Now looking back, I am thankful that I never left my job since Mark lost his job when his company downsized. This was a shock to him as well as other employees who were let go. When he told me, I wanted to panic also because we needed the money for household expenses and taking care of Tara. However, I knew if I panicked, he would get even more anxious, so I assured him that I would bear all the expenses around the house until he could get back on his feet. Since he did not have a job, I asked him to look after Tara so my mother could get a break from the babysitting duties. At first, Mark didn't want to, but eventually, he agreed. Every day, I would come back home to Mark sitting in the same spot on the sofa playing video games with Tara playing on the floor nearby. Basic needs like meals and baths were neglected, and I often returned home to find Tara hungry and unkempt. This would obviously make me pissed because on one hand, I had no choice but to work hard to single-handedly support my family, and on the other hand, I felt guilty that my daughter was being neglected. I remember that during this time, we would fight a lot more with Mark saying how he was trying to find a job, yet he never went for any interviews. 6 months after spending his days at home, Mark told me how he wanted to take up a business course. He had always wanted to start a business, but I just didn't think it was the right time since I wanted him to find a stable job for the time being. However, he apparently had discussed with his parents already who were ready to pay him for the college fees. I was the last one he informed, as if I meant nothing to him as a partner. I think this should have been my time to leave, but like a fool who refuses to quit, I stayed. While I worked and looked after Tara, Mark went back to study. Eventually, he graduated and started his own business. It was doing well, so he started hiring people under him. This is how Dani came into his life. She was this young girl straight out of college and was hired to be his personal assistant. Dani and Mark would spend hours together, but I never thought anything about it. The thought of him cheating never even crossed my mind. However, Mark started introducing Tara to Dani every time he took Tara to his office and insisted on Tara and Dani spending time together. This made me a bit suspicious. I asked Mark outright if there was something between him and her, but he denied vehemently, telling me that I was overthinking. I dropped it until one of my friends called me one day and told me that she saw Dani and Mark sitting in a cafe holding hands. She had no idea who Dani was, but from her description of that woman sitting with Mark, I knew it had to be Dani. I was not only embarrassed that my husband was cheating, but I knew that everyone would now find out about it. That evening, I insisted on Mark inviting Dani for dinner, telling him how I should know her also since she worked for him. He had no idea that I now had proof of his discretions. During dinner, I told him directly that I was done with them sneaking behind my back and that I knew everything. Mark froze as Dani went pale as a sheet. I told her that I didn't care if she was sleeping with my husband because at this point, no one could save our marriage. Dani and Mark looked at each other, and she finally confessed that she was in love with Mark. She went on to say that she didn't mean for this to happen and that she was sorry for everything. However, Mark asked me why I had invited Dani if I already knew everything and started telling me how I had no right to embarrass them. He told me how he was not going to sit there and apologize since I was the one who had failed at our marriage first. I scoffed as he went on to blame me, saying how I should have tried to keep him satisfied but I never did because I was always too busy trying to be independent. I shook my head and reminded him how my work put food on the table while he was jobless and also when he was off going to study. Mark argued that I could have left my job after his business was doing well, but I told him that I couldn't take any chances and we both needed to have jobs so we could bring in the income necessary for our future. I was so pissed at this man for trying to weasel his way out of this fiasco that I went on to tell him how I had never neglected him or Tara and always did all the house chores regardless of my job, so he had no right to blame me. He kept trying to blame me, but I ignored him. I looked at Dani and mouthed her good luck before excusing myself from the table. I knew exactly what I had to do now. In some way, Mark was freed from the burden of finding an excuse to divorce him. Yes, I used to be in love with him at one point, but since Tara, we had just become roommates living in the same house. I was the one doing the bulk of the work around the house anyway, so I had nothing to lose now by leaving him. I packed my bags along with Tara's while Mark kept asking what I was doing. I informed him that I was leaving and would be sending him divorce papers soon. He tried to argue, saying that I was being too cold and that we should take a beat to think about it, but I didn't think there was anything left to think about anymore. I simply had enough and went to stay with my parents for the time being. If you are wondering if his parents ever reached out to me and comforted me, then you were wrong. They never said anything to my ex for breaking up the family. It was only later that I found out the reason why. You see, Denise was not just young, she also came from a wealthy family as well, and by marrying her, Mark would be securing his money back. Honestly, I did not care about all that, and my goal was simply to ensure that Mark and I could be good co-parents for the sake of Tara. From my first impression, Denise didn't seem like a bad person, so I hoped that she could be a good step-parent for my daughter as well. During the divorce, I took half of my husband's assets, which was a lot since his business was making six figures. I bought a place for myself and Tara to live in. Mark and I had shared custody, so while I got Tara from Monday to Friday, he got Tara from Friday evening until Monday morning when he would be dropping her at school. After our divorce, he immediately let Denise move in with him. Tara would come back home and tell me how Denise and Mark would take her to expensive restaurants for dinner or to amusement parks.